The sun hit differently on the ocean than it did on land. It felt like he was closer to the sky. If Rowan closed his eyes and tilted his face up, he could pretend that the waves crashing against the hull of the Athens were gusts of wind roaring in his ears, that the ocean mist was a cloud brushing against his skin. He'd always wanted to fly. Being airborne scared him a lot less than swimming. Not that he knew how to swim in the first place, but he would take his chances in the sky sooner than in the sea. He sat on the deck of the Athens, pencil in hand, journal carefully balanced on his knees. A little boy was gleefully making fire appear on his fingertips near the ship's railing, much to his mother's exasperation. She was a bit young, maybe Rowan's age, and he didn't miss the dirty looks some of the older women shot her as they made their way toward the dining hall. He frowned after them. He knew they weren't upset about the magic. The Athens was captained by mages, utilized some of the best combustion spells ever crafted, and Rowan would bet all the money in his wallet, which wasn't much, but still, that the women were mages themselves. Small minds, he thought to himself, then sketched a scene of a rather large seagull stealing their expensive-looking hats. The drawing came to life on the page, the women jumping pathetically after the seagull, which flew high above them, swooped down just low enough to grab, then flapped its wings and soared out of reach. "All right now," Rowan said when the seagull tossed the hats onto its own head. "Give them back." Though it clearly didn't want to, the seagull swooped down, flipped, and expertly dropped the hats into graphite hands. The scene froze immediately after. Rowan smiled, scribbled a messy signature beneath it, and sketched some poppies in the corner of the page. He was a slight man who had just turned 20 in December. 2 weeks ago to the day, to be exact. And oh, how his family had hated him leaving home on his birthday, even though Rowan had told them time and time again that the Athens only made port in their town once a year. Not just that, but it was the only steamer that hadn't been converted to a hospital during the war. He wouldn't have to worry about waking up to ghosts. His grip on the pencil tightened, and he quickly drew more poppies as a distraction. The war was over. They'd won. That was that, and he wouldn't dwell on it any longer. "You can't just go making fire whenever you want, honey," Rowan heard the young mother say. "Remember what Papa and I told you." Rowan looked up in time to see the little boy's shoulders slump. "No fire unless we're at home," he said disappointedly. "And are we at home?" the mother asked. "No, Mama." "So should you be making fire?" "No, Mama." The boy sighed and scuffed his shoes on the deck. They were old shoes and a bit too big for him. Hand-me-downs, if Rowan had to guess. He smiled a bit. He'd worn his brother's shoes for a while before their mother got steady work. Times got tough for everyone, it seemed. A group of soldiers walked out on deck, brown uniforms seeming out of place on the ocean. Rowan quickly looked down at his journal. He'd long since ditched his own uniform for a simple gray suit, unable to take the scratchy wool and too-starched shirt. He'd felt like he was suffocating whenever he'd worn it. Not that the other soldier boys couldn't wear theirs, but Rowan wanted as little to do with old memories as possible, and the uniform was nothing but memories. He burned it as soon as he got home. A giggle from the little boy had him glancing up again, just in time to see a tiny orange flame on his index finger. His mother, briefly distracted by one of the soldiers, didn't notice. The little boy moved the flame from one hand to the other, smiling as brightly as the flame itself, and Rowan gave him a thumbs up when he looked at him. Rowan remembered the first time he used magic. He'd been 8 years old and an absolute terror of a child, according to Everett, a statement that Rowan had to agree with. There were 7 years between the two of them, and his older brother had spent most of his teenage years looking after Rowan while their mother worked. It was during one of her rare nights at home that Rowan cast his first spell. In their cottage, right in the main living room wall, Rowan's father had painted a grand mural of horses in a grassy field. All of the horses were beautiful, but Rowan's favorite was a brown Morgan he'd named Demi. He'd tried pronouncing Demeter, but couldn't do it at the time. He'd run his hand down her painted mane as if stroking it, and the horse had come to life with a soft whinny. Rowan smiled, thinking about the pride in Everett's eyes, the joyous smile on their mother's face as they both realized there was another mage in the Calder family. The memory was old and a bit faded now, but the best ones usually were. He hoped that the little boy would always remember making fire for the first time. Another mark of the graphite and a small sketch of the boy appeared on the page. The rocking motion of the Athens didn't make drawing easy, but Rowan had always had steady hands. According to Mother and Everett, Father had them too. I know, Rowan said to the drawing, which was now waving at him. "At least you can't get seasick, though." The journal had been a gift from his mother, enchanted with animation spells to breathe life into his sketches. Well, not literally, that was illegal. What the drawings could do were scripted ahead of time, but it was still fun to watch them dance and run around like children on a playground. Rowan rolled his eyes as the sketch started picking the flowers. "Hey," he said, don't go messing them up." One of the soldiers gave him an odd look. Rowan smiled sheepishly at him. He lifted the journal in explanation, gestured to the poppies that were now all over the page, and shrugged. The soldier eyed him some more, lit a cigarette, and went back to staring at the ocean. The dining room was the perfect picture of luxury. Crystalline chandeliers lit the room in a warm glow, and embroidered white tablecloths covered hand-carved teak tables. Attendants kept the food well stocked. Roasted racks of lamb with a brown mustard crust, grilled asparagus coated in a honey bourbon glaze, mashed potatoes with garlic and scallions, and fresh warm bread with softened butter. And of course, all of it served with hot spiced wine to ward off the chill from the nighttime sea. Rowan sat by himself at a small table, taking it all in. A live band played soft music that drifted pleasantly through gaps in the conversations around him. If he shut his eyes, he could catch bits and pieces of what they were saying. The soldiers at the table next to him had been stationed at Fort Iago during the war, and had apparently barely escaped when the others unleashed the blister gas. Rowan shivered despite himself. He'd seen his fair share of horrors during the war, but blister gas was by far the worst. One breath of the stuff and your lungs burned from the inside out. He tuned into a different table. A bunch of children laughed in delight as a puppet master made a doll dance by itself, leaping and spinning as gracefully as a bird. Rowan suddenly regretted leaving his sketchbook in his cabin. The puppet master would have made a fantastic drawing. A loud clatter nearly made him jump out of his chair, and he looked across his own table to see a man in a soldier's uniform just barely balancing several plates of food on his arms. He was tall, with neatly combed dark hair, the first hint of a beard, and he moved with such dexterity that Rowan instantly knew the sea was his home. Eyes as blue as a midnight sky found Rowan's, and they crinkled as the soldier smiled apologetically. "Sorry," he said. "May I set these here before I drop them?" He didn't wait for Rowan to answer, just put the dishes on the table one by one until they were no longer in danger. Rowan noticed he set some of them at different parts of the table, as if he was expecting someone else. "The name's Killian," the soldier said as he sat down. He was maybe 25 or 26, but he smiled with the confidence of a man of 30. "I hope you don't mind me joining you, but those lot over there," he pointed at another table of soldier boys, "are insufferable. If I hear one more story about their heroism during the war," he rolled his eyes, "I'm going to throw them overboard." Rowan blinked, then nodded. "There's no such thing as heroes in war?" "Nope," Killian said, letting his lips pop on the syllable. He reached for the flagon of wine on the table and poured himself a cup. "Just those who died and those who didn't." Lifting his own cup in cheers, Rowan sipped at the wine and cherished the taste of fruit and spices. "What's your name?" Killian asked after he'd drained his glass, already grabbing the flagon again. Rowan watched, concerned and impressed, as Killian swallowed at least half the wine in one swig. He glanced at his own glass, which was still mostly full. "Rowan," he said quietly. "Right." Killian studied him for a moment. "You're what, 18, 19? 20. Dark eyebrows shot up in surprise. Rowan fidgeted in his chair. He knew he looked young, what with his messy auburn curls and freckles, and he tried to sit up a little straighter. Killian smiled, shook his head, and waved a hand at him. "Doesn't really matter once you've killed a man, does it?" he said with a shrug, then snorted at Rowan's expression. "Oh, come off it, we were all in Garavon." The bulk of the war had taken place in Garavon, a small region with cold, wet winters and impossible amounts of mud. Rowan knew better than to think he could scrub all of it off. It was the type of grime that seeped into the skin that no amount of scalding water or scraping could fix. Killian must have noticed something on his face because he repeated softer, "We were all in Garavon." Rowan opened his mouth to answer, to say that indeed they were, when a voice rang out with more cheer than he'd heard since before the war. "Oh, for fuck's sake, there you are!" Killian gave Rowan a look that had "oh boy" written all over it, then started cutting his serving of lamb. Rowan looked behind him in time to see a blur of brown uniform and blonde hair making a beeline for the table. "You could have told me you switched," the newcomer grumbled as he pulled a chair out, spun it around, and straddled it. "But you left me with those people." Looking entirely unbothered, Killian chewed on a piece of lamb. "I was avoiding you." "Of course you were," the blonde sighed theatrically. "Asshole, didn't even get me food or nothing." Killian pointed his fork at the full plates to his right. The newcomer looked at them and blinked. "Oh," he said. "Uh-huh." Killian topped off his wine. "Now shut up and eat, Billy." Rowan stared as the newcomer, Billy, shoved mashed potatoes in his mouth by the spoonful. He was maybe a couple years older than Rowan himself, with blonde curls and energetic green eyes behind full dark lashes. His uniform looked a bit big on him, the wool jacket clearly taken in at the waist as an afterthought. Underneath the table, his foot tapped out an incessant rhythm. "He bore you to death yet?" Billy asked Rowan around all the food in his mouth. "Because that's all he does, you know." Rowan blinked and glanced at Killian, who rolled his eyes. Rowan said hesitantly. "No?" "Good." Billy poured himself a cup of wine, took a long swig, and instantly made a face. "Oh, what in the hell is that?" "Spiced wine," Rowan answered. Billy looked at the cup like it was full of oil. "It's hot." And you're annoying, Killian said, then smiled when Billy shot him a glare. Sorry, thought we were pointing out the obvious. He effortlessly dodged the asparagus that Billy threw at him, then turned to Rowan. So, what brings you aboard the Athens? Caught off guard, Rowan did his best not to let it show. The food on his plate suddenly became the most interesting thing he'd seen all day. Just wanted to see what's out there, he said, aiming for nonchalance. Oh, bullshit! Billy was trying to saw off a chunk of lamb with a butter knife, but he looked up at Rowan as he said, You're joining the Mages College in Sanfira. Rowan's eyes widened. He glanced around at all the tables, at the soldiers drinking in groups, and fought hard to keep his breathing under control. Combat magic was widely accepted, no doubts there, but Rowan, and pretty much every mage in the world, knew that if it weren't for its usefulness, non-combat magic would probably be illegal. Rowan also knew that the men and women he'd fought alongside, who liked him well enough, would change their opinion right quick if they knew he was more of a scholar than a battle expert. Ironic, considering alchemical and enchanting mages helped win the war against the others. The Mages College was the only place in the world where the study of non-combat magic was actively encouraged. The city of Sanfira also considered itself a scholarly refuge, having elected more mage officials into office than anywhere else. Rowan had first heard of it while in Garavon, and after the Battle of Serenora. He'd been by the river, washing the blood off his hands, and overheard two men from his regiment talking about what they were going to do when they got home. They never noticed him, probably wouldn't have talked so openly if they had. There's a college in Sanfira. Supposed to be a godsend for people like us. People like us, what, sissies and pansies, just because we don't enjoy burning folk alive with fire spells? Shh! Do you always gotta be so loud? I honestly don't give a rat's ass if anybody hears me. Well, I do. Rowan had helped bury them a week later, after the others ambushed their regiment on the march to central Garavon. He didn't remember their names, or their faces. People look the same when they're dead. But that was Garavon. Rowan blinked and found himself back aboard the Athens. No, I'm not, he said, sounding unconvincing even to his own ears. Billy snorted. Sure, he said as he swirled his wine in his cup. You tell your mother that lie? Rowan's face flushed with anger. I don't lie to my mother. And I don't lie to new friends. Billy smiled and put the cup on the table. With a quick flick of his wrist, the wine started spinning in the opposite direction, a whirlpool of spice and warmth. Especially fellow artistes, he finished with a wink. I can't cast a lightning spell to save my life, but goddamn can I brew a fine potion. No need to be ashamed of who we are, right? The words, I'm not going to the Mages College, were almost out of Rowan's mouth before he realized they wouldn't do any good. He'd already proven himself a terrible liar. Mother and Everett always called him on it. Everett, in particular, seemed to know exactly when Rowan did something foolish or got himself into trouble, which, to be fair, happened quite a bit. And every time, Everett would tell him the same thing. I'm just looking out for you. Even just thinking about that made Rowan suppress an eye roll. Everett may have fooled their mother and maybe himself into believing that lie, but Rowan knew the truth. As one of the most decorated battle mages during the war, Everett had his career to think about. An unruly, troublemaking little brother wouldn't buy him any favors with political leaders in need of a decent court mage. Fine, Rowan said, eyes firmly fixed on his food. I'm going to the college. Happy now? Ecstatic. Billy smiled again and leaned forward in his chair. You should look me up sometime at the North Horse. Rowan glanced at him with a frown. At the what? The North Horse, Killian said, then explained. It's a boarding house. My cousins immigrated to Sanfira a while ago and set it up. A lot of mages fresh off the Athens stay there until they can afford something of their own. Huh, Rowan said. Do you know what they charge? Killian gave him a curious look. Rooms rent by the month. $30 for the ground floor, $20 for the upper. He cocked his head to one side. Don't you have a place to stay, lad? For all of his planning and dreaming about what he would do once he got to Sanfira, Rowan hadn't given much thought to housing. Avoiding Killian and then Billy's questioning stares, he pushed the food around on his plate. No, he admitted quietly. The silence at the table was uncomfortable. Rowan waited for the certain, you're kidding, or why not? He didn't feel like explaining himself, especially not to two people he'd only just met. He would be fine. He always was. But the questions never came. Instead, Billy exchanged a look with Killian, waited for him to nod, then said, Well, you can stay with us. It took all Rowan had to maintain some level of dignity and not immediately jump at the opportunity. Billy, who Rowan was learning had a knack for reading people, noticed his expression and rolled his eyes. It's a boarding house for a reason, he said. Kinda makes its money off of people, staying there. And, he stabbed a piece of asparagus with his fork, if you're on the fence about it, they have a dog. Rowan blinked. What does that have to do with anything? Nothing, Killian said, exasperated. I swear, Billy, the more you talk about Bodhi, the more she's going to hate you when you actually meet her. Bitch, 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 Billy grinned at Rowan. Dogs love me, hate him, and you're rooming with us, okay? There wasn't much Rowan could say in protest, and if he thought about it, he didn't really want to protest. That, and he was fairly certain Billy and Killian wouldn't let him say no. So smiling at the two of them, he lifted his glass in cheers and said, Here's to being roommates. Billy clinked their glasses together, eyes sparkling like gems with mischievous glee. Here's to making his life, he gestured at Killian, an absolute living hell. He burst out laughing at the look of sheer murder on Killian's face, and Rowan found himself laughing too. Oh, for the love of... Killian swallowed his wine in one swig. Two of them.